he goes to dinner and he comes back and he says to one of his friends in London, he said, "Oh, yeah, it was really interesting. I was the only non Keynesian there."
Yeah.
you know?
So Keynesianism is more government intervention, fiscal policy. So put the government at the center of influencing the economy. And then the different flavors of whether it's Austrian economics or Chicago School of Economics is saying no, we have to put less government intervention and trust the market more. And the formulation of that from Milton Friedman is trust the money more. The not trust, but the money supply is the thing that should be focused on.
Yes. So the Austrians and the Chicago schools see economic prosperity and growth comes from individual initiative, individual entrepreneurship, kind of private sources. The private market is what drives economic growth, not the public sector. And so for Friedman, then the question is, what is the government's role? And because he's lived through the Great Depression, he's not laissez faire and he won't ever be laissez faire. Now, interestingly, Hayek, living through the Great Depression, at first is laissez faire. And he's like, sure, like let it rip. And things get so bad that Hayek's like, okay, that's not going to work.
Can we actually define laissez-faire? So what do we mean? Like, what's the free market? What's laissez-faire?
Yeah.
What's the extreme version here?
So laissez faire means leave a be in France. It's more often used as an insult than as an actual. Very few people are completely and totally laissez faire. That would be like the pure laissez faire would be the sort of pure, maybe pure anarchist position, like the state does nothing or the state isn't even there. But it tends to, if I could maybe make it more precise, it would be focused on freedom of contract, would be essential. And that means um, like the buyer of labor and the seller of labor must have absolute freedom to contract. So that means no minimum wage law, no working hours law, no employment law, things like that. That was, and this is all pre-progressive movement. A lot of things are that way, right? You know, imagine you're in 19th century America and you have a farm and you hire someone to help you on the farm. You offer the money, they take it. If they fall off a ladder and break their back, maybe you help them out, maybe you don't, right? But there's not a whole apparatus of legal liability and safety and things like that. So that would be one piece. Another piece of laissez faire would be free trade amongst nations. So no regulation of who can invest in a nation or who can take money out of a nation. So Nippon Steel could come and invest in US Steel, and there would be no grounds in which to reject that. Or you could, as a billionaire in the United States, relocate you and all your money to another country, and the United States couldn't try to keep you, and nobody else could stop you from coming in. Um, and so, and then in the context of economic crisis, laissez faire would not encompass centrally provided relief because in the pure theory, again, very seldom applied purely, but in the pure theory, the wages need to come down far enough and people need to be desperate enough to start taking work and to start the machine again. So the theory would be if you give people relief, they might not go back to work. Now, almost nobody says that in the Great Depression because the situation is so bad and people are starving on the street and people feel for humanitarian and ethical reasons it's not okay to say that. The Austrians, though, at first, Hayek and Lionel Robbins are like, this is a business cycle and it needs to run its course and it will be detrimental if we intervene. And then pretty soon, Hayek has to change his tune.
So the Austrians are the most hardcore in terms of laissez-faire.
Absolutely. And so Hayek will make the turn towards accepting more of a state and then will come to talk about how the state needs to support what he calls a competitive order. But his mentor, Ludwig von Mises, still remains very hardcore and is not really open to things like unemployment insurance or other state-based interventions.
What does von Mises say about like human suffering that's witnessed in the Great Depression, for example? Like, what are we supposed to, as economists, as humans that define policy, what are we supposed to see when people are like suffering at scale?
Yeah, I wish I knew an answer to that question. I don't know enough about von Mises and his reaction in the Great Depression. I think I would hazard that he would look more to the down the road and say, well, if you start here, you're going to go places that are bad. But I don't factually know what he said in response. I do know that Hayek's position doesn't last very long. It's not a position you can hold to. Maybe you could hold to it in other cycles. The other thing that was interesting is I found very few Americans saying this. Most who were kind of small town electeds, or the most famous is Andrew Mellon, quoted by Herbert Hoover. So not directly. We don't have him on record saying this, but apparently Hoover records in his memoirs that Mellon said something like, liquidate real estate, liquidate stocks, purge the rottenness out of the system. People will live a healthier life. And certainly there were members of the Federal Reserve who felt like it would create, they didn't say moral hazard, but it would create what we now call moral hazard, bad habits, were we to intervene and to save failing banks, because failing banks need to be taught a lesson. They need to be taught discipline. And so a lot of people, I think, saw it in the context of discipline. This is discipline. And if you remove the discipline, you'll be taking away something fundamental in society.
So Milton Friedman never quite went all the way to laissez-faire.
No, no, he didn't see that. And what's really interesting is the number of incredibly radical proposals that he and his teachers were floating. So I've mentioned Frank Knight. Another really important influence on Friedman was Henry Simons, who was a junior professor at Chicago. And Simons had this idea for what he called 100% money, which would be a law that says banks have to hold 100% of the deposits they receive. They can't loan them out on the margin.
Mm.
So this would completely and totally have overhauled the US banking system. And he would have said there's a category of things called banks where you get deposits, and then there's going to be a category of sort of, he didn't say investment banks, but investment vehicles that will invest. So similar to what did happen in some ways in the banking reforms, in that in the 1930s, the investment banks were split from the deposit banks, and the banks that took deposits were much more highly regulated and they were supported by the FDIC. But the point being, the Chicago school had these very radical proposals for reform: go off the gold standard, restrict the currency, change the banks, immediately relieve payments now. What is important to note, though, is that they thought of all of those as emergency measures to get through the emergency, not as permanent alterations in the state of what had to be, and not permanent alterations between state and market. Where the Keynesian assumption is things have changed, times have changed, we're in a new dispensation, and we need a new relationship. So Milton Friedman is very open to doing things differently in a state of emergency. He will have different ideas during World War II than any other time. And that's why I argue I think he would have been supportive of at least the first rounds of coronavirus relief, because I think he would have put his emergency thinking hat on. So in that way, he was definitely more flexible.
You mentioned Hayek. Who is this guy? What's his relationship to Milton Friedman in the space of ideas and in the context of the Great Depression? Can we talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So F.A. Hayek is an Austrian economist who takes up a posting in London, and he's in a mentor, a mentee rather, of Ludwig von Mises. He's writing about business cycles, Austrian capital theory, and the depression hits, and he's one of the few economists who in the beginning really is not calling for much intervention. Although, as he realizes how politically unpalatable that is, he will develop a more softened version of Austrian economics that has room for a whole range of social services. What's significant about Hayek is that he is also watching what's happening in Austria, what's happening in Germany, and he's really worried the same thing is going to happen to the Western democracies. And he sees the root cause of this is socialism, the shift towards an expanded role for government, which we've been talking about is happening in the United States. It's also happening in Britain. And so he writes this book that becomes incredibly famous, The Road to Serfdom, basically saying taking these steps towards a planned economy or an economy that's a modified form of capitalism is going to could he's very clear that this is not an inevitability, but if with the same steps are taken and people follow the same line of thinking, we may end up in a sort of coercive totalitarian state. So this becomes enormously popular in the United States. First of all, he's in good touch with Friedman's teachers even before this book comes out. They see them as kindred spirits. Frank Knight is in touch with him. Henry Simons is in touch with him. They all see themselves as liberals. They call themselves old fashioned, unreconstructed liberals. And so, even before he becomes famous, Hayek will be trying to kind of organize thinkers and intellectuals who he believes shares his values of what we would call today classical liberalism, and to kind of create a counter consensus to the one that's gathering. Now, Hayek also chooses not to argue against Keynes, and he feels that this is a huge missed opportunity, that he should have staked out the case against Keynes, and that because he did not, people come to believe there is no case against Keynes. Keynes is literally unanswerable. So Hayek will have this great regret. He will channel some of his regrets into sort of community building, specifically developing the Mont Pelerin Society. And it will fall to Friedman to really make that case against Keynes. But Hayek will end up at Chicago, and Hayek really influences Friedman to think about what Hayek calls the competitive order and how the state can and must maintain a competitive order. That is, a system of laws, of norms, of practices that makes it possible for markets to function. And this is one of these key differentiators between the older philosophy of laissez faire and the newer reconceptualization of liberalism, which says, yes, we need a state. We need a state that's not intervening in markets under social democratic auspices, but is structuring and supporting markets so that they can function with maximum freedom, keeping in mind that if there aren't basic social supports needed, the market is apt to generate the type of either inequality or social instability that will call the whole system into question. So Hayek is really key in promoting this modified liberalism. But from being a very prominent economist in the 1920s and 1930s, as mathematics becomes the language of economics, Hayek is completely left out in the cold. Now, Friedman to some degree is left out in the cold, but Friedman at least has proved to the mathematical economists that he knows what they're up to, and he's rejecting it from a position of expertise and knowledge. And he literally drives the mathematical economists out of Chicago. They're clustered in a group called the Coles Commission, and he makes their life hell. They flee. They flee the Friedman onslaught. But then when Hayek arrives at the University of Chicago, he would like to be considered for a position in the economics department. And Milton Friedman says, no way. You're not really an economist because you're not empirical, because you just develop these theories. So he has an appreciation for Hayek as a social thinker, but not as an economist. So what Friedman decides to do, his answer to Keynes will be deeply empirical, but it will also be theoretical. And it will create an alternative intellectual world and approach for economists who aren't satisfied with Keynesianism. And almost single-handedly, Friedman will introduce sort of political and ideological diversity into the field of economics, because from his beachhead in Chicago, he will develop the theory of monetarism. So, what is monetarism? The easy way to summarize it is this famous dictum of Milton Friedman's: inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And it's fascinating that he becomes an expert in inflation because the first research and the first major research product of monetarism is that theory of the Great Depression in a monetary history of the United States. And that is a theory of a deflation, all prices going down. And he will go back to an idea that Irving Fisher had popularized, but a very old idea, almost a truism, the quantity theory of money, which says the level of the price level is related to the amount of money circulating in an economy. So if you have more money, prices go up. If you have less money, prices go down. Now, this seems like very basic and almost too basic to bear repeating, But Friedman is saying this very basic relationship holds true even in an advanced industrial economy. And that is what people have started to doubt. And if you think about money, you think about banks, you don't think necessarily about the federal budget, spending, and taxation. And what you see happens in American economics, the textbooks previous to the Keynesian revolution, they spent a lot of time on money. They spent a lot of time on interest rates. You can do word counts, and other scholars have done the word counts. And then word count for money after World War II just plummets. And you start seeing things like taxation, budget, those things go up. So that the what happens is the economics profession shifts its attention. It just looks away from money to other things. And Friedman is one of the few who's saying, no, money still matters, money still counts. And it's a very counterintuitive argument to make. It's a very historical argument to make. And this is absolutely fascinating to me. With Anna Schwartz, he develops this 150-year time frame. He also has students working on episodes of hyperinflation in different periods of time. He's also looking back to like ancient history, inflationary episodes there. And he's saying this is a law of economics. This is something that recurs throughout time. It's not historical, right? It's not contingent. It's a law of economics. And, his Keynesian counterpoints are saying, no, that's not relevant any longer. Maybe once it was relevant, but it's not relevant today. Now, in some ways, they have a point because in order to pay for World War II, the federal government sells a lot of bonds. It issues a lot of debt, and it wants to pay this debt back at a low interest rate, and it wants people to keep buying it. It wants the low interest rate to be competitive with other interest rates. So it wants, in general, low interest rates throughout the economy. And the Federal Reserve has been so discredited by the Great Depression that the Treasury basically runs the Federal Reserve and says, keep interest rates low. And so that's what it's doing. And so the Federal Reserve has stopped being an independent entity. It's just a sub sort of department of the Treasury. But in 1951, they negotiate what's called the Treasury Fed Accord. And the Federal Reserve gets its independence, but it doesn't really use it. But statutorily, it now has it. And so most economists are just observing a regime in which the Federal Reserve has no power, a regime in which there is really little inflation. The inflation that is seen is there's a little burst of inflation in the Korean War. And they're saying inflation's not really important. It's not really relevant, and money's not really relevant and important. And so to break through and to make the argument, that's why Friedman and Schwartz go to history, and they're able to make that argument for history. So then Friedman is coming out with a variety of papers that are saying, when I look at economic fluctuations, he maps them side by side to fluctuations in the money supply and says, look, they fit. And other economists, remember, they're building complicated mathematical models. And Friedman's doing extremely simple stuff. And they just think it's dumb, it's not interesting, it's not true. They don't buy it at all. And so, but after a monetary history of the United States, they have to pay attention. So it's really in those years, Friedman is hammering this idea of monetarism, and it starts to become something respectable, bordering on respectable for other economists to look to and think about. And that's really the beginning of the kind of Keynesian monetarist split, where if you start to give Friedman any credence, you're heading towards a monetarist position. Now, at the same time, Friedman comes out very publicly in 1964 as a supporter of Barry Goldwater. And Keynesian economics has found a home in the Democratic Party. Its probably brightest moment in the sun is the administration of John F. Kennedy, who brings in a lot of Harvard and Yale professors to the Council of Economic Advisors. He proposes a series of spending programs that are really guided by the Keynesian philosophy. And Barry Goldwater is tremendously controversial, part for his votes against civil rights, which Friedman really supports, in part because he's a hardcore libertarian in an age when that's not in the political mainstream or not discussed in the political mainstream. And I mean, he's just tremendously unpopular, particularly in all the educated precincts where Friedman lives. So Friedman is like an outcast and a pariah for his support of Goldwater. And so that actually really affects monetarism because people feel that this is now becoming a package deal. And so there's a great reluctance to embrace Friedman's ideas because it seems like you would then have to embrace his politics.
Ah, so it's associated with conservatism.
So this is the years when conservatism, there is a movement that calls itself conservatism. And Friedman is very tightly allied with this movement from the beginning, partly through his friendship with William F. Buckley. And a lot of people say to me, yeah, but Friedman's not conservative. And this is like a bigger, we have a whole separate podcast on this. But
Hmm.
for now, I'll just say that conservative in the United States becomes a political brand that contains elements of conservatism that are recognizable across time and space, embrace of tradition, or comfort with hierarchy, etc. And it also has something new and different, which is Friedman's ideas about Milton Friedman's advocacy of more free markets, less government regulation, and the benefits of capitalism and the benefits of freedom. And that gets folded into American conservatism, in part because Milton Friedman is such a powerful intellectual figure. And after his advocacy of Goldwater, the media realizes this guy's really smart. He has really interesting things to say. He makes great copy. He makes a great guest. And he starts writing a column for Newsweek magazine, which is a very big deal in a much more consolidated media environment. And he's quoted in all the newspapers. And so his public profile really starts to rise right as he's pushing monetarism as an alternative to the Keynesian synthesis.
Can we just linger on what is monetarism?
Yes.
Like
Okay. I
once
didn't go
again,
into it.
so like what? Okay, the money supply.
Yes.
So money is this thing that you can think of it a notion where people buy and sell stuff, and there's this fascinating, complex, dynamical system of people um, contracting with each other in this beautiful way. I mean, there's so many pothead questions I want to ask
Yeah.
here
Yeah.
about the nature of money. I mean, money is fascinating in that way, and I think for Milton Friedman, uh, trusting the flow of money is really important,
Yeah.
and the signals that pricing and money in general provides is really important.
So, yeah, and some of this, I could take some of this back again to Frank Knight. So, one thing Frank Knight said to all his students was the market is the best allocation mechanism we have.
Hmm.
The market is what allocates resources in a situation of scarcity. The market allocates them the best. And Hayek will add to that by saying prices are information signals, and a price sends information to buyers and sellers about how they should act. And these are the two of the strongest arguments for why the government should not intervene in the price system, because it will blur information or because it will allocate less efficiently than market allocation will. And so, what Friedman is really going to add to that is maybe going up a level and thinking in the macro about the whole economy and how money circulates through that economy as a whole. And so, what he and Anna Schwartz do is they construct what are called monetary aggregates. This is adding together, say, all the money that's on deposit in banks and all the money that's believed to be circulating in people's wallets. And you also have to really go back in time. You know, we don't have credit cards. Um, there is a stock market, but it's tiny in terms of the number of people who invest. There aren't mutual funds. You know, like when travelers' checks are introduced, this is like a big deal. So we have a very simple monetary system. And so Schwartz and Milton Friedman start measuring what they call the monetary aggregates. They focus on M1 and M2, and their favorite aggregate is M2, which I believe is encompassing sort of deposits and circulating medium. The other thing to recall, there's some fine distinctions between um, money in savings accounts and money in checkings accounts. And money in savings accounts can earn interest and is generally believed not to circulate, or money in checking accounts does not at that time bear interest and cannot legally bear interest, and so is thought of as circulating. And then there's different institutional architectures of postal savings banks and credit unions. So, but Friedman is one, taking the focus to these aggregate amounts of money and saying, um, these really have a lot to do with economic booms and busts. When we have an expansion in the amount of available money, we see an expansion in economic activity. When we have a contraction in available money, we have a contraction. And so he says at this stage, the government, through the mechanism of the Federal Reserve and its influence on interest rates, can either make money more cheaply available and more freely available in the economy, or can make money more expensive and slow things down. But the central core idea of monetarism is this is potentially very bad if the government can hit the gas and then hit the brake and hit the gas and hit the brake based on, say, what a politician wants or what somebody at the Federal Reserve wants. You have a lot of instability in the system. And so, one of the core policy proposals of monetarism is let's grow the money supply at a steady rate. And in the beginning, Friedman just says K percent. He doesn't even put a number on it because he says the number doesn't matter. What matters is the steadiness in the growth rate. Because if it's a steady growth rate, it will fade away. And then people will make economic decisions based on the fundamentals, not based on what they think is going to happen, not based on hedging against inflation or hedging against deflation. They'll just be able to function. So, this is sort of the paradox of monetary policy. When it's happening right, you don't see it, you don't notice it. When it's happening wrong, Friedman argues, it can just fundamentally destabilize everything. It can cause the Great Depression, can cause an artificial boom. And so he's taking monetary policy at a time when most economists think it's completely irrelevant and saying this is the central game of the economy. Now, we live in a world where we believe this, and the Federal Reserve chair can't open their mouth without headlines being generated. But Friedman is saying this at a time when the Federal Reserve is like a mysterious and secretive organization. It's not well known, it's not deeply appreciated. Some of the only people who appreciate the Fed's power are like hardcore rural populists who have constituents, who think the banks and money power are the problem, who are like, throwbacks from the frontier days. So Friedman, in the beginning, has no constituency for this policy. He has no constituency for this analysis. And so, just going back to summarize monetarism, it's using the quantity theory of money to analyze the macroeconomy. It's proposing a policy of slow and steady growth in the money supply. And then it is arguing that inflationary episodes, when they emerge, are profoundly driven by changes in the money supply, not by anything else.
I mean, and going even up a level as we started, how epic is it to develop this idea, to hold this idea, and then to convince the United States of this idea that money matters, that today we believe is mostly correct for now.
Yeah.
And so, like, just this idea that goes against the experts and then eventually wins out and drives so much of the economy, the biggest, the most powerful economy in the world. So fascinating.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a fascinating story. And so, what happens is Friedman has advanced all these ideas. He's roiled the economics profession. He's built a political profile. And then he becomes the head of the American Economics Association. And he is asked in that role to give a presidential address. And so he gives his presidential address December 1967. And he says, I'm going to talk about inflation and I'm going to talk about the trade off between inflation and unemployment. And this is what's generally known as the Phillips curve. And the Phillips curve, in its original form, is derived of post World War II data. So it's derived of about 12 years of data. And it shows that when inflation goes up, unemployment goes down. And the idea, would make sense that as the economy is heating up and lots of things are happening, more and more people are getting hired. And so this relationship has led policymakers to think that sometimes inflation is good. And if you want to lower unemployment, you could let inflation kind of go a little bit. And in the crude forms, it becomes to seem like a menu. Like you could take your model and you could plug in, I want this much unemployment. And it would say, well, great, this is how much inflation you should do. And so then you would target that inflation rate. So Friedman gets up and he says, this is wrong. This might work in the short term, but it's not going to work in the long term because in the long term, inflation has, first of all, it has a momentum of its own. Once it gets going, it tends to build on itself. The accelerationist thesis, it accelerates. And once inflation gets going, and the reason it gets going is because, workers go to the store and they see the price level has gone up. Things have cost more. They ask for the wages to go up. Then, people eventually the wages will go up too high and they will no longer be hireable, or companies will decide at these high wages, I can't hire as many workers. I'd better lay off. So if inflation keeps going, eventually over the long term, it will result in high unemployment. So he says theoretically, you could end up in a situation where you have high inflation and high unemployment. This hasn't been seen, but he says theoretically this could happen. And then he goes and he says, and the government has started expanding the money supply. It started expanding the money supply in 1966. So we're going to get a bunch of inflation and then we're going to get a bunch of unemployment. And he estimates about how long it will take. And then he says once this all happens, it will take about 20 years to get back to normal. And
And he predicts the stagflation of the 1970s.
stagflation of the
How
90s.
gangster is that for an economist to do that? Again, against the the mainstream belief represented by the Phillips curve.
Yeah, and what really makes it happen is that many of the economists who most deeply dislike Friedman and most deeply dislike his politics in the 1970s as they're running their models, they start to say Friedman's right. They start to see in the data that he's right. And a very parallel process happens in Britain. Britain is going through a very similar sort of burst of spending, burst of inflation. And so Friedman is vindicated in this very profound way, in the way that he himself said would be the ultimate vindication, which is my theory should predict. So that prediction of stagflation is really the sort of final breakthrough of his ideas, and also, their importance to policy, um, and to thinking about how we should intervene or not in the economy and what the role of the Federal Reserve is, because he's saying the Federal Reserve is incredibly powerful. And finally, people start to believe it.
And I don't know if we said, but to make clear, stagflation means high unemployment and high inflation, which is a thing, like you mentioned, has not was not seen before,
Yeah.
and he predicted accurately. And it also disproves the sort of the relationship, the inverse relationship between um, unemployment and inflation.
Yeah. Now, I should say the Phillips curve is still out there. It's been expectations augmented and it is relevant in the short term. But Friedman's warning is still very much apt that if you get too focused on unemployment, you can let inflation out of the bag. And so, until very recently, the Federal Reserve's tradition has been focusing on inflation, believing that's fundamental and that will keep unemployment low rather than trying to lower unemployment at the cost of raising inflation.
Can we go back to Frank Knight and the big picture thing we started with, which is the justification of capitalism?
Yes.
So, as you mentioned, Milton Friedman searched for a moral justification of capitalism. Frank Knight was a big influence on Milton Friedman, and including on this topic of understanding the moral justification of capitalism. I think you spoke about Knight's case for capitalism was grounded in the idea that the ability to act in the face of uncertainty creates profit, and it should, because taking risks should be rewarded. So, like this idea that taking risks in the face of uncertainty should create profit, and that becomes a justification that the ethics of capitalism. Can you just speak to that?
Yeah. So Knight is talking about where does profit come from? And to his mind, it comes from the entrepreneurial function and the risk taking function. And so he kind of weaves that into why, capitalism works best and why it's the most effective allocation machine and why it assigns responsibility in a way he believes that a socialist system never could. Now, Knight, though, is not a booster of capitalism. It could be in part because he's just a darkly pessimistic, kind of depressive guy. And so he's afraid that capitalism is going to collapse and socialism or fascism is going to take over or communism. And so he kind of descends into darkness there. Friedman, as the more optimist, believes with Hayek that you can develop a different approach to capitalism that would preserve the price system, preserve allocation, but build in social supports, build in a social minimum, things like this. But there's a moment in his career where he's really struggling to figure out, like, how do I make this case for capitalism? And basically, the whole sort of conservative movement, or people who we later call the conservative movement, are struggling to make this case. And he starts thinking about what makes capitalism work is that if you put forth effort, you get a reward. So then you could say, well, people get what they deserve under capitalism. But then he kind of stops and he says, that's not really true because we're born with such different endowments in the right position and some people aren't. So if I say capitalism is moral because people get what they deserve, that's not really true. And he also kind of has like an ethical reaction, which he ends up calling like an aesthetic reaction. He's kind of like, it just doesn't feel right to say that. And so he struggles for a while with like, what do I say? And then he basically says, capitalism, it can't be the core. Discipline of the market can't be the core to your ethics. It has to be something else. So that's when he will decide it's freedom, it's individual freedom. That's really the ethical core. And capitalism makes individual freedom possible because capitalism is dedicated to maximizing that. And so the defense of capitalism comes through freedom. And at his stage in history, he's able to set aside nice worry about inequality and say, when I look at the data, and this is true for the macro data at mid century, incomes are actually converging. Right. And it also, if you look historically, if a country goes from, say, a more feudal agrarian society to a more market based society, incomes will converge. Now, then they might start to diverge. But Friedman's in the moment when he's seeing the convergence. And so that's what he's really focused on. So he believes he can justify capitalism through the ethic of freedom. And he also believes that inequality um, is a problem that can be addressed through specific policies, and it's not a fundamental feature of capitalism. In other words, he doesn't see capitalism as an engine of inequality the way that Frank Knight did, and the way that, maybe some critics on the left would.
How did he conceive of freedom? So, individual freedom, economic freedom, political freedom, civil freedom. What was the tension, the dynamic between those different freedoms for him?
So he really begins focusing on economic freedom, and he says it's really important to focus on economic freedom because in the United States, we don't value it enough. So by economic freedom, he means the ability to um, keep what you've earned, the ability to make decisions about your business, the ability to make decisions about the work that you do. So this will translate into things like there shouldn't be a minimum wage. He believes the minimum wage has bad social effects, but he also believes you should be free to accept a job at a wage that you yourself have determined is acceptable to you. Um, and there should be very minimal regulation, questions around safety and other things, because the market will ultimately, if you create an unsafe product, it won't sell, and that's sort of your incentive. So he really centers economic freedom because he thinks, especially, and he's really speaking from his vantage point in the universities and speaking to the kind of liberal consensus of the 50s and 60s. He thinks economic freedom has been under implemented. He's traveling the world, and this country is now being ruled by a dictator, Augusto Pinochet, who starts introducing economic freedom, but there's no political freedom. And Milton Friedman believes eventually these two things are going to go together. He tells Pinochet, you've got economic freedom, and eventually it's going to mean political freedom. Pinochet is like, okay, fine. Not really interested in that. I want to know what I should do about inflation. But then when Milton Friedman leaves Chile, he is attacked and vilified for having been a supporter. He's interpreted that he's a supporter of the regime. Realizes he has talked too much about economic freedom and he hasn't talked enough about political freedom. And he's kind of assumed political freedom because he's come from the American context. So then he starts recalibrating them and saying, you know what? If you don't have political freedom, you're never going to be able to hold on to economic freedom. So he sees that they need to go together and they don't naturally go together. And so he starts to become more clear in talking about political freedom. Now, let's fast forward to the end of his life, and he's witnessing the emergence of what we call the Asian tigers. So,
Mhm.
capitalist economies that are doing very well, but they don't have political freedom. But then he observes they don't have political freedom and that you can't vote in a free and fair election, but they also don't have a Stasi, they don't have a KGB, they're not, hauling people off for their wrong opinions. So then he says they have something called civic freedom. And so he kind of defines this third sphere, civic freedom of, you know, debate, discussion, interpersonal relations, but you can't be political. So this is a late in life edition. I don't think it's fully theorized. I think what it shows is that during the Cold War, he very much believed economic and political freedom, capitalism and freedom, democracy, the United States, capitalism, this all went together. And he starts to see at the end of his life the emergence of different social systems that are using market trading and allocation, but aren't giving people similar freedoms. And he's kind of puzzling over that. Now, he always believes that China will democratize, and he thinks China's on the path to democratization, in part because Chile does democratize. Eventually, Pinochet is voted out, and it's become a democratic, capitalist, and very prosperous country. And he thinks that's exactly what's happening in China. He sees Tiananmen, and he doesn't live long enough to get to where we are now, in which doesn't look like political or civic freedom is coming to China anytime soon.
And he did oppose the dual track system of China, meaning like the market is bottom up, the government in China is top down, and you can't have both.
He thought you couldn't have both.
Yeah.
He thought eventually the market would triumph.
Well, that's a really powerful idea to say, okay, maybe there's not political freedom, but just hold on to the economic freedom, and
Mhm.
eventually that's going to give political freedom. Is that correct to say like start to work on the economic freedom and the political freedom piece will take care of itself?
That's what he believed. That's what he believed. Yeah, I think it's more complicated than that, right? The people who gain out of a system of economic freedom could decide to collude in a system where there isn't political freedom. That's certainly a scenario. So, but that was again, that's that core idea of freedom, right? And that core belief that people want freedom and that people are drawn to freedom.
Just to go back to Frank Knight a little bit, he wrote an essay called The Ethics of Competition. He had the metaphor that economic life is a game. And then maybe that extends to society as a whole. Like the entirety of it is a competitive game. And and Milton Friedman, I think, adapted some of this, appreciated some of this. Can you speak to this metaphor?
Yeah, I think what the metaphor of the game does is it asks you, okay, well, what are the rules then? And let's focus on the rules that keep the game going. So he didn't use the concept of an infinite game, but I think that's an interesting one. A game that all the players are in and keep going again and again and again. And so that helped Knight, along with Hayek, shift from the allocation question, who's getting what, are things allocated fairly, to the more structural question of like, what are the rules of the game that we need to keep this system going? And so for a while, that led to the discussion of monopoly. Well, we need rules against concentration, or we need the rule of law. Everyone needs to be treated equally. People need to know what they're up against. And then going back to monetarism, the core of monetarism is a rule. Friedman called it a monetary growth rule. And so, again, what keeps the economic game going is a rule about how much the money grows that everybody knows. Nobody's guessing. Nobody's changing the rules to help their side or to help, the people they're friendly with. We all know it's there. It's clear. It's easy. And so that emphasis on rules, I think, really has a through line. It goes into Hayek's competitive order, and then it goes into the monetary growth rule. And then, today, monetary policy makes use of monetary policy rules. We have not abandoned discretion, but rules are used as a heuristic or a check, and those come out of Friedman's thinking. And so it's something it's really profound, and it was always counterposed to discretion, which Friedman worried would be subject to capture or political corruption if you had discretion in policymaking or if you had discretion in these very big areas. Then people would stop competing against each other in a market and they would turn their attention to getting control of the rules or the rule makers.
So if there's clear, transparent rules, then you're free to play the game.
Yes, exactly.
But then depending on the rules, the game can turn out the equilibrium that it arrives at might be different, right?
Mhm.
So that's speaks to the mechanism design, the design of the rules.
Yeah, and that was again to go back to the idea separating new liberalism or neoliberalism from classical liberalism was more of a focus on what are the rules that are needed, what is the competitive order that we want to set out, how do we design in social safeguards, um, how do we think about it, and so that shift towards monetary policy and focusing on stable monetary growth that becomes really important in the post 70s era is one of the basic rules of how capitalist economies should function. And it becomes really important because they see the example of, say, countries, most notably in Latin America, where monetary rules weren't followed and different governments played politics with their currencies. And that created just huge upheaval and huge social loss, economic loss, just economic disaster.
So my friend lived. She's a poker player, philosopher of sorts, great human being. She has a podcast called Win Win that everybody should listen to. And the whole purpose of the podcast and her whole way of being and spirit is to find win win solutions. So, do you think of economic life as having such win win solutions? So, being able to find rules where everybody wins, or is it always going to be zero sum?
I definitely believe in win-win, but with a big asterisk. Like you can have win-win, but it can feel like win-lose, which is it's not just are people getting more? It has a lot to do with do people feel they're getting more and do people feel they're getting what's fair and equal? So you could have a situation, for instance, if you look at the history of going back to Chile, it has steady growth, steady income growth, steady diminution of inequality, and a high level of discontent within the society, and a high level of belief that the society is corrupt and unfair. And that's what matters. How people feel about it, how people perceive it matters. And you can't, we saw this recently. You can't just come out with a bunch of statistics and tell people you're winning in this game if they feel like they're losing. So that goes to all the non rational factors and all the comparative factors that people have when they think about where they are vis-a-vis other people in society. So we're just incredibly social creatures. We're incredibly attuned to our status, to rising and falling, to where we sit vis-a-vis others. And so that absolutely has to be attended to. It can't just be an economic analysis.
That's so interesting that the experience of the economy is different than the reality of the economy. On the topic of corruption, I think the reality of corruption versus the perception of corruption is really important in a lot of these nations. You take Ukraine, for example, the perception of corruption has a big impact on the economy. You don't want to invest, you're very cautious as a business person. The reality of corruption can be way different than the actual perception. But if narratives take hold, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that it has a big effect on the psychology of the people involved. It's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to Keynes's analysis of the Great Depression, right? If people won't invest, if they're spooked, if the investing classes are spooked, you could be in real trouble. And in some ways, the simple analysis of the problem and proposal of a solution was enough to restore um, eventually the path to economic prosperity, right? That's Franklin Roosevelt. Nothing to fear but fear itself. The sense of we know we have a future, we have optimism, then you believe in it. And to go back to like thinking about money, right? Money works because we all believe in it. It's a form of social trust, and it's a form of belief and faith in our society and in the other people in it. And when that breaks down, the money system will break down as well.
Is there something that Milton Friedman said and thought about, how to control the psychology of humans at scale?
No, I mean, what's interesting is he does talk, especially in his later work, he says we have fiat currency and this is an experiment, and
Yeah.
we don't know how it's going to turn out. And it's turning out okay right now, but we've always had a commodity based or backed currency of some form or another. And this is the first time. And so who really knows. So far, so good. And he also is very attuned. It's interesting in his later writings when he's thinking about this to, sure, I could design a monetary system that would be different. But when I look at history, I see that monetary systems have always, say, incorporated the role of the state because it's so important to people. And so, therefore, my theoretical designs really have to be tempered by what I've actually seen happen in history.
So maybe we could speak to this tension between how much government intervention is okay for Milton Friedman. So he was against minimum wage, but he was for guaranteed minimum income. Can you explain actually the difference between the two?
Yeah, so this was one of the discoveries I made in my research. I found a paper from 1938 he wrote advocating what we would call today a universal basic income, a minimum income. And he basically sees this as part of the effort to create a new liberalism, right? And he basically says we have advanced societies, we have prosperous societies. We have decided, in keeping with our morals and our ethics, that people should not be starving in an advanced society like this. The question is, how are we going to make that happen? And he ended up believing the best thing to do was to put a floor under everybody. And he said, you can get that based on your income. If you have a lot of income, you don't get it. If you have a little income, you might get a little bit of it. If you have no income, you get enough of it. And he believed in the beginning you should base that on, what was required to buy food, right? That would be kind of an objective. You could objectively determine the nutrition and the price of food. And so that for him it's important, he says it's keeping with a liberal polity because it's not intervening in the price system. It's not intervening in economic relations. And it does not, in his view, require a bureaucracy to administer. It does not, in his view, require that you qualify for it by virtue of being in a protected class. You just get it as kind of part of your membership in this general citizenship body. And so that to him was really different than a minimum wage because it did not interfere with the work bargain. His belief about minimum wages was specifically that it priced out unskilled labor, that what an unskilled laborer had to offer was a willingness to work for a very low wage. And if you set the minimum wage too high, businesses, instead of hiring that higher priced labor, would not hire, or like we could think of today, right? They put in electronic checkout, or something like this where you don't actually need the labor. So he really believed the minimum wage had that perverse incentive. Now this is a live debate on what minimum wages do, and there seems to be a level at which you can set them that they can not have that perverse effect and in fact can kind of create people with more spending money that then powers the economy. So he had a very sort of clinical analysis of that rather than an empirical one or a really abstract analysis. But the minimum income is fascinating because it seems very leftist to us. But what it is it's purely individualistic, and it never really happened because it was so purely individualistic. Because American social policy typically identifies like this group of people is deserving and will give them benefits. So the classic example is soldiers, veterans. Another example is mothers raising dependent children. These people deserve money. The rest of you, you better go out and work. And so Friedman's proposal, it really caught on in the 60s. It ultimately went nowhere, but it was no litmus test, um, no income analysis, just we're going to give you this much. Everyone's going to get this much. And he decided once mass taxation had come in, you could do it through taxes and you could just rebate people who didn't pay income taxes, got a rebate. That actually came to pass. It's the earned income tax credit. And it's considered extremely successful, by policy analysts. It does what it's supposed to do. It's not that expensive. And so I see that as a kind of paradigm of his thinking in that instead of creating a bureaucracy that does some form of redistribution, or instead of trying to intervene in the market for labor or the market for something else, the market for housing, you provide a cash grant that people spend for themselves. And so, interestingly, that's what happened in the emergency situation of COVID, right? That's exactly what people did. They followed that model. We just get money out quick. And there's a lot of discussion still about UBIs is something that should be done. And I think it's always going to be hard to pull off because I think Americans and their elected representatives don't want to provide a universal benefit. They want to provide a targeted benefit because they believe there's like a moral component here. And Friedman advanced a policy that was really abstract and really just, you know, kind of it was devoid of judgment. It was like pure and beautiful in that way, but like utterly impractical.
And it really focused on not interfering with the market and the signals that the market provides. Like, it was really against price controls for the same
Yeah.
kind of reason.
Yeah, exactly. You could say, okay, but how does this not interfere with the market, right? If you provide people with a minimum income, won't that change their incentives to work, et cetera? I mean, there's a big body of research on this. Most of it seems to show one, it's way better than the current benefits cliff where you have to not work to get your benefits. And any incentive impact on working seems to be much lower than would be expected. But I'll let the economists and the social science just fight that one out and figure it out empirically. Hopefully, we should be able to.
Yeah, there's been a bunch of studies. It's interesting, even just how you conduct studies like this, how you do
Yeah,
these kinds of experiments, especially if you're empirically minded. Because these a lot of the studies I saw is they're pretty small.
right.
And so, how do you make big conclusions about how to run the world, how to run economies from such small studies? It's all a fascinating experiment of ideas. And it's also inspiring to see individuals and maybe small groups of individuals like the Chicago School of Economics to sort of shake up what we believe and how we run the world.
Yeah,
Inspiring.
yeah.
You call Milton Friedman the last great conservative. um, Maybe to be a little bit sort of controversial and make bold statements that get everybody excited. But what do you mean by that? And what makes a great conservative?
So I was really thinking of that in terms of kind of American political identities and particularly the 20th century conservative movement, which, people are always saying this isn't conservatism. And I was like, yes, in America, conservatism is different. It looks different. It feels different. Conservatism in America builds in a big component of what we could call libertarianism, pro capitalism, anti-government ideas and critics will say but conservatism is about conserving institutions and practices and it has a role for the state and an organic community, but in the United States it's always had since the 20th century this anti-statist, um let's let the market rip. Let's not worry about what the market does to establish traditions. The market is our tradition. Capitalism is our tradition. So that was really synthesized, many people were there, but Friedman and the importance of his books, Free to Choose, Capitalism and Freedom, the television series he did, all of these were like core components of this American conservative synthesis as it evolved. And I really see that as having broken down. It is scattered into different pieces, and we don't know where they're going to come back together again. But, you know, Friedman's push for open global markets, unfettered free trade, that's getting pushback on both the left and the right. Um, you know, that I think is just a major sign that, both parties have turned away from this vision. I don't know what they've turned to. But the way that Friedman brought these pieces together, I think that political moment is past. So that's what I was trying to talk about with the book title. There's another way, though, in which I think of him also as a conservative, which is that within the field of economics, he went back to this older idea, the quantity theory of money, and said, this still has value. This can be applied in the modern day. It is something to teach us. And he, pushed back against this trend towards mathematicization. So he kept writing books. You can still pick up a Friedman book and read it, whereas lots of economics articles and output, it's like unreadable unless you're in the field. And so I think in that way, he was trying to conserve methodologically and intellectually the traditions of the field. The work that he and particularly Anna Schwartz did, that literal accounting of things and deep analysis of data from the field, that was like completely unfashionable in his time. Now we've sort of gone back to it with big data and with computers, but he helped bring that forward and preserve that tradition. So I think of him kind of intellectually as a conservative, if you think of the mode of his thought. And so I mean, what makes a great conservative is one who takes those older ideas and makes them fresh for a new time period. I think that's exactly what he did.
You've also spoken about the fact that the times when he was sort of out in public, the there was more of an open battle of ideas where conservatism often had, William F. Buckley. He had a more vibrant, deep debate over ideas where it seems less deep now.
I mean, that is the thing that it's hard, especially like for the students I teach today to be like, there were arguments about ideas and conservatives won a bunch of them, and that happened in the 70s and late 1960s to 1970s when one set of arguments was about economics. Like, okay, this idea of stimulating the economy by spending more, it has a downside. The downside's called inflation. And the downside's called too much regulation. And you've gone too far in kind of bottling up the actual sources of economic growth and dynamism, and we have to let those free. In social policy, there was also a critique. The Great Society had all these ways of ideas of ending poverty, and people came and analyzed them and said the programs aren't helping. In some ways, you've actually created engines to trap people in poverty because you've given them a benefit and said if they actually start to work, they lose the benefit. You created these all these perverse incentives, and these ideas were fought out. They were empirical, they were controversial, and they were based on really deep research and really deep argumentation. And so, um, it seems that era has passed. It seems like we're driven much more quickly. Um, by moods rather than thought through ideas. Right now, it seems like the ideas come after they follow the political mood and try to put together the underpinning of it, where it really was the opposite for much of the 20th century.
It does seem like we lead with emotional turmoil
Right.
and the ideas follow versus lead with the ideas and the sort of the emotion of the masses respond.
Right, exactly. So if we think of the evolution of conservatism, it was a whole set of ideas that was crafted, refined, the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, sort of really found their emotional standard bearer, translator, salesperson in Ronald Reagan, who incidentally had been following these ideas as they developed and had been honing his ability to express them and apply them politically. It's a very opposite if we look at Trump as the political definer of the era. There's a set of ideas, but it was more attitudes, impulses, vibes, and the ideas are coming after that, trying to figure out how they patch on. So it's interesting to watch to see that difference. And I hazard that a lot of it just has to do with the immediacy of the media environment we're in and it's just power of the media messages to get out so fast.
What do you think Milton Friedman would say about Donald Trump, about uh, him winning in 2024, and just in general this political moment?
I think he would love Doge. I think that's, it
He would
goes
focus
without
on that
saying.
part.
I think he would focus on that part because I think he would really love it. He would be very alarmed by the idea of tariffs and very alarmed by the return to protectionism. I mean, I think he believed that part of what made the world peaceful in the second half of the 20th century, as opposed to during World War II, was the world was knit together more by trade. And that was the great hope that if people traded with each other, they wouldn't fight. He was also, a proponent of the free movement of capital. He would absolutely oppose this idea that Nippon Steel wasn't allowed to invest in the United States. I think he would struggle, and he wholeheartedly embraced Reagan and he worked to minimize the parts of the Reagan legacy he didn't like. I think he would find it harder to embrace Trump because he's not of that style and he just had a different style. But I'm guessing he would have come around through I think he would just say, okay, we have a chance to reduce the size of government. At the same time, the spending plans of the Trump administration are not fiscally conservative in any way. And that was his concern, was not so much with debt, but with the feeling that there's no mechanism to stop the growth of government, that it just grows and grows and grows. And so he ended up believing like even deficits aren't so bad because they make politicians cautious, he thought, about continuing to spend. But I have to believe he would be concerned about the potential threats to the US currency's position as the world's reserve currency with increased levels of debt and spending. Um, he was concerned about low interest rates, he died, I think it's 2000 and 2004, 2006, but it was in the beginning. He didn't see the zero low bound, but he saw low interest rates. And he said, this isn't necessarily good. Everyone's talking about low interest rates as if they're good, but there should be a price on capital. There should be a price on this. It shouldn't be so low. And so, um, he had some of still the kind of macro insights that I think are important.
You wrote the Wall Street Journal essay titled "How Inflation Ended Neoliberalism and Reelected Trump." So, can we weave that into this discussion in terms of inflation and Trump? What's the main idea of the essay?
So the main idea is kind of looking back and saying, so today we have been living in a world where people have been, focused on monetary policy, steady monetary policy, free trade, reducing regulation. This is all called the neoliberal era. And my argument was a lot of that was driven by inflation. So we have Milton Friedman predict inflation in 1967. It starts breaking out in the 1970s, Britain and the United States. And every institution was designed around stable prices. And once inflation broke out, prices were no longer stable. So, for example, tax rates weren't inflation adjusted. So, if your income went up because of inflation, you might bump from a low tax rate to an extremely high tax rate, but you don't actually have more money. On paper, you have more money, but everything costs more. So, you don't actually have more money and your taxes have gone up. That kicks off the taxpayer revolt. There's a whole shift of American corporations towards focusing on financial investments because the tax breaks they used to get for depreciation for building new factories are not inflation adjusted. So they no longer pay off in an inflationary environment. And then when Paul Volcker comes in 1980s, early 1980s, and starts fighting inflation, really pushes up interest rates to bring down inflation. And that completely reorders the banking sector because banks had statutory legal limits on the interest they could charge. And once general market interest rates exceeded that, there was proliferation of new financial forms to take advantage of that. So my point was the era we live in was ushered in by inflation. And then everyone turned against all the formulations we had and said, well, these have hollowed out our industrial base. These have we've got too much immigration. We've got too much economic openness. We need to reshore. We need to focus. We need to turn against all these things. We need to spend more. We've disinvested. And the net result of that turning away, I argued, is people forgot about inflation. They really forgot it could ever exist. And you had a whole set of theories on the left, modern monetary theory, that basically said we don't really need to worry about inflation. We can spend what we want. And lo and behold, inflation came back. And so my argument is that has now opened the door to the presidency of Donald Trump, which is potentially a deeply transformative moment that will change the size and shape of government, that may change our foreign policy profoundly, that may change our immigration policy, it may change the demographics of our country. All of that. And my thesis is that has all been made possible by inflation. And so the great mistake of the past years was to forget how fundamental inflation was to the rise of the last political order and to profoundly underestimate how much inflation would change the current political order. So I just think it's one of these things. This is why I think you should study history, because I think if you had studied history, you would be aware of this. And it's so easy for people to forget, just like the banks forgot that interest rates could ever go up. They got so used to it. And it's only a 10, 15-year thing, but to them that seems like forever. So I really do believe what history teaches you to do is just have a much vaster scope in your vision and then take into account the possibilities of so many things happening that are different than what's happening today. And so I just hope we don't forget about inflation entirely. But here's the thing: is a quite a strong chance that Trump's policies will initiate even worse inflation, and then they will prove to be his undoing. So the ironies of inflation could be continuing.
Like you said, Milton Friedman would be a big fan of Doge. So if he was still here today and rolled with Elon Musk and Vivek, what advice would he give? What do you think he would focus on in terms of where to cut, how to think about cutting?
His signature policy move, I talk about this, is the price mechanism and trying to make that into the policy. And that seems sort of obvious to us today in the era that he came in. So there would be rent controls. Let's take away rent controls. Let's let housing prices set themselves. Or he was very against national parks. I actually think the national parks are good. So I hope the Doge people don't take this up. But rather than an allocation to fund the national parks, they should be funded by the revenue that they bring in when people visit them. And so I think he was always looking to let's let prices make the decisions here. So I think that would be one of the key pieces. The other thing I think he'd really be thinking about, he wrote about this a lot about occupational licensure and barriers to entry. And he felt like one of the worst things that government does, and sometimes it's private entities that do this, is create barriers to entry to protect industries and markets. So he talked about this in the case of the medical profession, which I think is actually not a good example because I think we all have a collective investment in having medical doctors be highly trained. But so, for instance, you could look at, nail technicians or hair cutting. There's often these licensing requirements, or there's a sort of big kerfuffle. I think it's the DC passed a law that to run a childcare center, you have to have a college degree. Well, what does that do? I mean, that disenfranchises a whole bunch of would be entrepreneurs who don't happen to have a college degree, but probably could be really good at this particular business. So I think he would be saying, um, look out for where private interests have used the state to protect themselves and clear away those types of barriers and let um, competition through prices guide outcomes.
Yeah, so open up for more competition and allow for more signals from the market to drive decisions and so on,
Yes, yes.
which would actually naturally lead to cutting a lot of the bureaucracy of government.
I think the other thing he would probably be arguing for is, again, going back to the design of the minimum income or the negative income tax, that there's a way he and ultimately decided to run it through the tax system, right? The government's already collecting this data. They already have your information and they can just send the money out through the system rather than having a social bureaucracy where you have to come in person, you have to fill out forms, you have to document, do you own a car, what's your income, who lives in the household. So I think he would say, and his analysis of that was who that really benefited was the bureaucracy that processed that paper.
If that's a word,
Yeah.
but just convert everything to where the speed of signal can be instantaneous. So um, there's no paperwork. It goes immediately. And then that means that the pricing signals and all these kinds of things are just immediately available to people.
That seems to be the low hanging fruit. Government, IT systems could be vastly improved upon.
But that would result again with a lot of people getting fired. And I think somebody submitted a question for me saying, like, where's, what are your thoughts as a person who cares about compassion? What are your thoughts about government employees, which there's a lot of that are going to be hurt by Doge?
Yeah.
And it's always a really difficult question. A lot of people get fired to make room for a new system that's going to lead to a lot of pain.
There is going to be a lot of pain. I don't know what the solution is. I think that's also part of why Friedman favored a minimum income. He talked about it being sort of counter-cyclical. In other words, when things were really bad, the spending level on it would naturally go up. This is what economists today call an automatic stabilizer. Um, and then when it's not needed, the cost of it goes down. Um, I mean, maybe there's a way to make it sweeten it with honey and have people take buyouts or things like that. That would certainly be a way better way to go.
I did a podcast with Javier Milei. He has consistently praised Milton Friedman and cited him as one of his inspirations. So, what do you think Milton Friedman would say about what's going on in Argentina and what Javier Milei is trying to do in Argentina?
Yeah, I think he would appreciate it. I mean, I think Malay is much more of an Austrian inspired thinker, but I think he definitely appreciates Friedman. And on the macro level, Friedman always understood it's really painful to treat inflation, but the more you put it off, the harder it is. So I think he would be trying to get him, as he's doing, to just message that short term pain, long term gain. I think he'd be very supportive. I think he'd be thrilled to see also that Malay is very good at explaining these abstract ideas and putting his policies in the framework of the bigger picture. That was really meaningful to Friedman. I don't know how politically persuasive it is overall. Malay's very intense. He doesn't have the same sort of gifts of salesmanship and setting people at ease that, say, someone like Ronald Reagan had. But it seems to be that's what his country was calling for right now. So,
Yeah, yeah, he is more chainsaw, less like
yeah,
warm blanket.
yeah.
uh, Javier recollects this line from Milton Friedman. I don't know if this is accurate, but if you strive for equality over freedom, you often get neither. But if you strive for freedom, you often get both. Do you think there's truth to this?
I think on the big picture, definitely. I mean, we've seen focusing too much on equality can be because equality is such an alluring word.
Hmm.
It can lead you to downgrade all kinds of other things that are really important. But I really think it depends on how you're defining freedom. I mean, the statement is too big and too broad, right? So, if you're talking about freedom, if by freedom you mean not having to pay taxes if you're successful, I think that can have all kinds of knock on effects, right? The idea that people are able to prosper when they're educated. Where is education going to come from? How is that going to be paid for and supported? And again, to go back to Knight, if you're generating too much inequality or people are feeling that you're generating too much inequality, sometimes they value that more than they value freedom. And so I think I think there has to be more of a balance. And it's hard to make such global statements. I think you have to break them down into what actually do you mean. But again, Malay is coming from a very different context, a very different country that has seen so much upheaval, so much government intervention, so much inflation, so much political turmoil. Um, he's probably thinking about it differently than Friedman was thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, there probably still is a real threat of hyperinflation. There seems to be a very high level of corruption or the capacity for corruption. So it's a really messy situation. So Javier Milei mm, likes to recollect this great line from Milton Friedman that if you strive for equality over freedom, you often get neither. But if you strive for freedom, you often get both. Do you think there's truth to this?
Yeah, I think in the macro, for sure. I mean, we've seen if you really put equality as it's such a seductive ideal and people believe in it so much that they can carry out horrible crimes, in the name of equality. But then focusing on freedom, these words are too big. They're so hard to define. And so I think you have to ask sort of like, what is the freedom you're talking about, right? If you're talking about the freedom of ordinary people to be entrepreneurial, to make their own way, to start new things, to continue what they're doing, to keep what they've earned, for sure. I think that can increase the equality overall. If you're talking about lower taxes, if freedom is just a code for lower taxes, there has to be, I mean, lower taxes in general, great. But if you're one of the top generators of wealth, there has to be some way to ensure that, say, education, right? People prosper when they're well educated. That's when economies do better. Education is generally state funded, and you need some way to support that and provide for those institutions that structure society that make competition possible. So I think it's just a really broad statement. But again, Malay is coming from a really different context. He's coming from the South American context, from such upheaval, such economic devastation, in pursuit of the goal of equality that I think balance with that emphasis on freedom. I definitely see where he's coming from.
If we can pivot a little bit, we've talked about Reagan. What are some interesting stories about how Milton Friedman navigated? What are some interesting stories about how Milton Friedman navigated the Reagan and maybe even the Nixon administrations, and how he was able to gain influence?
Well, the Nixon administration is an interesting case because so I've been talking about inflation and the different consequences it had. One consequence it had is that it began to undermine the Bretton Woods currency system that was established in the wake of World War II. Now, Bretton Woods, what it did basically, it ended up inadvertently putting the US dollar at the center of the world economic system. But under Bretton Woods, countries of the industrialized West agreed to trade their currency in set ratios that government set. So um, a franc was worth so many dollars, or a German mark was worth so many francs. And then also under this system, and they could trade the dollars that they held for gold because the US was on a sort of modified gold standard. There was a ratio of gold to paper money. And so the system was set up, and very quickly, most countries were the dollar was at the heart of it, and that the converting into and out of dollars was really the mechanism of trade for many of these countries. So Friedman said, what we should have is floating exchange rates. Again, of instead of having a top down design of policy, an administered policy, we will have policy set by prices. And you should be able to trade currencies on an open market. They should trade and they should fluctuate, and that would be fine. Totally outlandish idea. But he was pinpointing the fact that Bretton Woods had an instability, and that instability began to emerge in the time of inflation. So you have more and more dollars being printed. They're worth less and less. If European nations keep trading their currency for dollars, they're going to be importing inflation into their own economies. So they say, we don't want these dollars. We'd like some gold instead. And they have the right to go to the treasury, send in an order, and get gold out. And so they start doing this more and more, and it becomes, it's called the gold drain. And the United States starts running out of gold. They're aware this is happening through the 60s. They're trying various things to fix it. And when Nixon comes into office in 68, Friedman sends him a memo and it says, um, this is going to be a real problem. He says something like, this is a running sore and you have to lance it right away. Some very
Nice,
graphic
very nice.
metaphor. Otherwise, it's gonna it's gonna explode. And Nixon just files the memo away. Nixon loved people to think he was influenced by and followed him of Milton Friedman, but he didn't actually want to do that. He
Hmm.
he just wanted the a political benefit that came from it. So then comes the moment where the US Treasury Department realizes we're going to run out of gold. What should we do? And everybody decamps to Camp David, and Nixon decides we're just going to stop redeeming currency for gold. It's called slamming the gold window shut. Done. And he also at that same meeting decides to institute price controls. He does a whole bunch of stuff. It's an emergency. He calls it the New Economic Plan, which is an unconscious echo of the Soviet New Economic Plan. So, a problematic name, a problematic policy. And Friedman is livid at the price controls, but he's like, actually, it's great that you closed the gold window. Let's go all the way to floating exchange rates. And this idea was heresy within the Treasury Department. Everyone's very committed to the idea of the gold standard, convertibility, possibility, the United States at the core of the financial system, kind of hem and haw. But at this point, Friedman has a very close relationship with George Shultz. And George Shultz is a high level appointee who will eventually, over the course of the Nixon administrations, become the Treasury Secretary. And so Friedman is feeding Schultz all his ideas about how we should move to floating exchange rates, how we shouldn't try to reconstruct Bretton Woods. And the people in Treasury it's funny because I've read some of their accounts, and actually Paul Volcker is in the Treasury Department at this time, and he can kind of sense that Friedman is in here somewhere, like feeding his boss ideas.
Yeah.
He doesn't quite know. And then in the oral history, Schultz talks about this quite a bit. So, right, Friedman exerts this behind the scenes influence, and what Schultz does is just kind of lets Bretton Woods fade away. He doesn't make grand pronouncements. It just slowly the world shifts to a regime of for a while it was like a regime of steady prices, and then they call it a steady regime of changing prices or whatever. The language changes, the reality changes, and they kind of end up where they are. So that's a real measure of Friedman's influence. Another economist in Schultz's ear that said, no, catastrophe is imminent. We have to go back to Bretton Woods. He probably would have worked harder. The US government would have worked harder. And so that becomes one of these pieces of globalization. And what people don't realize is there used to be, in addition to these floating set capital ratios, you couldn't bring capital in and out of different countries. You had to register, you couldn't invest. There were all these rules and strictures, and the falling of Bretton Woods really blows that all open. It's a precursor to globalization. So Friedman is right there. Now, he's very ambivalent about Nixon. I mean, he sees that Nixon is not an honest person. He thinks he's very intelligent. And Nixon's dream is to create a new centrist majority. So he does many things to go back on his supposed economic principles and ideals. So Friedman does not like this. He doesn't like the price controls. He's in communication with his old mentor, Arthur Burns, who's now the chair of the Federal Reserve. And Burns is basically doing everything wrong in monetary policy. And I describe this in the book in some detail, these anguished letters back and forth. And basically, as I see it, Burns doesn't have a solid theory of inflation. And the more Friedman pushes him, it's almost like Burns is willfully ignoring Friedman and kind of doing the opposite of what Friedman says. So Burns is running a very loose monetary policy. Inflation is quite considerable over the 70s. I mean, we were all spooked by what did it get to 6%, something like that recently for a very short time. This is inflation going over 10%, hovering in 8% for basically the whole decade of the 70s, going up and down with extremely elevated rates. And so the Carter presidency largely falls. Foreign policy is a big part of it, but the failure to tame inflation is part of it. And then Reagan comes in. And now Reagan loves Friedman and Friedman loves Reagan. Very mutual feeling. The Reagan administration creates like an advisory economic board. Friedman's on it. He's retired now. He's entering his kind of golden years. But he really has Reagan's ear. And here what he does is he convinces Reagan of his theory of inflation, which is inflation has been caused. It's a monetary phenomenon that has been caused by bad monetary policy. Inflation has an accelerating dynamic. The only way to end inflation is by really showing and signaling that government policy has changed. And when you do that, it's very painful for a short amount of time. People will suffer, but then you will come out on the other side into stable prices. And this is what you need for economic prosperity. So the man who implements this policy, Paul Volcker, he's definitely influenced by Friedman, buys the big picture of Friedman. He even buys Friedman's specific technique of the monetary growth rule and of the focus on monetary aggregates, which Friedman has said, right? Money matters, aggregates matter. That's what money is. Pretty quickly, Volcker finds that because of inflation and the financial deregulation in response to it, the aggregates don't work the way Friedman said they would. And so the specific policy Friedman recommends, Volcker tries it for a year or so, doesn't work super well. But what does work is letting interest rates go high, go above inflation to a point where both the general citizenry and the financial markets believe, like, oh, they're actually serious about inflation. And because we've had a decade of inflation with all these presidents saying, forward, we're going to whip inflation now, that monetary policy has lost credibility. This is why people focus so much on credibility today, because once it's lost, it's really hard to get it back. And one way Volcker gets it back is interest rates over 20%, unemployment very high, as high as 25% in like construction sectors. And as this is happening, Milton Friedman is whispering in Reagan's ear, this is the right thing. Stay the course. This is going to work. Now, interestingly, he hates Volcker. Volcker hates him. And Friedman will never give Volcker credit for this policy, but he will give Reagan credit for this policy. But he owes credit himself for keeping Reagan from wobbling on this policy and just pushing it through. And he also tells Reagan very pragmatically, you better do this now. You've got a 4-year term. Do this in the first 2 years of your term. Things will have turned around by 1984 when you run for reelection and you'll benefit from it. And that's absolutely what happens.
If we could take a small tangent,
Yeah.
sort of a question I have to ask about, since we mentioned Bretton Woods and maybe the gold standard, maybe just have a general discussion about this whole space of ideas. There's a lot of people today that care about cryptocurrency.
Hmm.
What do you think that Milton Friedman would say about cryptocurrency and what role crypto might play in the economy? Whether he would be for this idea, against this idea, and if we could look at it for today and also just, 10, 100 years from now.
There's a clip, I think it's in 1992, where people say, oh, Friedman predicted cryptocurrencies because he's talking about how payments will eventually be electronic.
Yeah.
So in some ways, he definitely, as he was looking at the computer and money, he knew these would come together in some way. I think he probably would see a use case for crypto. He definitely would not buy the stronger forms, I think, of crypto ideology in which we could be heading towards a future in which there's many different currencies that compete or that are distributed, or there's a stateless currency. And he addresses this very, very clearly because Hayek's denationalization of money, it's a paper in the late 70s. Hayek argues for this kind of competing currency model or regime. And so he's responding to that. He's responding to people writing about free banking. And he basically says, look, even if you developed a variety of competing currencies, eventually society would converge on one. And that's because people just want one currency that they know. They don't want a bunch of different options. Even in places where there have been options to do that, they've been used very minimally. And then he says, secondly, the state always steps in. He says, technically, theoretically, it doesn't have to. I could draw you a model, I could tell you about how it could work without the state. But in actual reality, all human societies through time and space. The state eventually becomes involved in the provision of money because it has so many knock on effects to so many people. So, sure, I think he would, again, find a use case for crypto, think it's interesting, but I don't think he would see it as this is going to displace state money and we're going to have um, a variety of distributed currencies. The other thing he really stresses is that a change in a monetary system, it only happens amid great, great crisis. So again, you see in countries where the state is not controlling the money well, right? That's when people are more turning to crypto. But he says because money is so fundamental, there's going to be so much political pressure on any country that gets the currency profoundly wrong that the government will fall and another one will replace it, right? So if you look at episodes of hyperinflation, they don't go on very long because they're so upsetting to people.
If we can go back in time, we've talked about it a bunch, but it's still a fascinating time. The Great Depression, University of Chicago. There's these folks like Jacob Viner, Frank Knight, Henry Simons. All of these influenced the thinking of Milton Friedman. There's this Room 7 situation at
Yeah.
the University of Chicago. Just going back there, even just speaking almost philosophically, what does it take to explore ideas together, sort of like deliberate, argue in that space? And maybe there might be interesting stories about that time. It would just be interesting to understand how somebody like Milton Friedman forms. The seed is planted and the flower blooms.
Yeah. Yeah. So he gets to University of Chicago. He makes fast friends. And in his third and fourth year, they become what I call them the Room 7 gang. So Room 7 is they find an old storeroom in the basement, they take it over, and that's where they have their jam sessions. And what made this world come together was Frank Knight. There was a charismatic leader, and there were a bunch of acolytes who clustered around him. That I think was a key piece of the ingredient. And then there was a sense that they were onto something that the rest of the economics field had forgotten or was rejecting. So there was like that sense of mission. So that seems to have been there was a formal education piece And then there was a parallel education piece rooted in admiration for a thinker, a shared admiration. And then what that led Friedman to do, what I found syllabi, that he had from non-economics courses, lists of books, and he'd written the prices of different ones he wanted to read. So he had, John Stuart Mill on Liberty, like 50 cents written in the margin. So he began to educate himself. He gave himself a like parallel curriculum alongside this very formal economics curriculum. He started reading, the traditions of political liberalism and then talking them through with friends and then developing like a shared sense of mission. And that the incredible thing is of those friends in the group, they scattered for like 10 years and then they all came back together. George Stigler, his great friend, was hired at Chicago. Aaron Director, who was his wife's brother, was at Chicago. So many of these people continued. He became Frank Knight's colleague. So that was the base. That was what really grew him, that really profound peer group. Now, the other piece I talk about a lot is Freeman was a collaborator, an open-minded collaborator, and he had incredible connections with economists who were women. And he basically found, first in the figure of Anna Schwartz, later in the figure of this group of women who were his wife's friends, this kind of untapped pool of talent. And so he immersed himself in this whole other world of consumption economics. And that resulted in, his more technical work on a theory of the consumption function, which is the theory of permanent income. So for Friedman, intellectual work and intellectual production was always done in this very social context, in a context that blended like friendship and intellectual partnership. And he only had a handful of friends who were not also economists interested in the same questions he was. So he just lived and breathed ideas all day long.
Can you speak to the jam sessions? Like, what do we know about the jam sessions? What are we talking about here? You're sitting in a room. Are they analyzing? Are they reading papers and discussing papers, or are they arguing more like over beers kind of
Yeah,
situation where you're
more arguing over beers. And in this case, there's several people who say it was all about Frank Knight. What did he say? What did he mean when he said it? Is he right? And so Knight was he would say one thing and then say another. If you read him, it's very hard to follow what he's actually saying because he's full of qualifications and ironies and blends. And so he would throw out these pieces and then the students would kind of clutch at them and then they would come back together and try to assemble this sort of worldview. And then Frank Knight fell into this terrible depression. And to cheer him up, they planned a big party and they went back through all of his previous writings and they assembled them into a book that was published. This is The Ethics of Competition. And you can read the introduction written in part by Milton Friedman. So not only were they talking about Knight and what he said, but then they started pouring over his work. And one of them described it as like a general equilibrium system where you like had to like know all the parts and then all of a sudden it all fit together in a whole. So if we step back, what they were doing was getting inside the mind of a great thinker and understanding the ways it all fit together and then kind of testing their ideas against Knight's. And what's fascinating is one of the first papers that Friedman publishes in Statistics is a rebuttal of Frank Knight. He publishes a rebuttal of Frank Knight's ideas about risk and uncertainty. And Frank Knight, he kind of took a black swan argument. He said, risk you can calculate, uncertainty, you can't, like existentially, philosophically. You can't get your hands around it. It is the black swan. And Friedman publishes this statistical paper and he says, I can put uncertainty on a graph, And so there's that sort of Freudian killing of the father element when he comes back and he will, in some ways turn his back on Knight's approach and Knight's pessimism, even while it's like a foundation of his thinking.
fascinating? Is there something you could say about the thinking process that Milton Friedman followed, like how he developed his ideas? You mentioned there's a strong collaborative component, but there's another story I saw about that I think his son recalled about the argument number system that you
Yes.
mentioned, which I,
Yes.
by the way, if you can explain that as a tangent of a tangent, that's really awesome. I think it's like
Yeah.
number one if the other person is right.
Number 2 means, you were right and I was wrong.
Mhm.
And the number system evolved in some ways to be quick and efficient, but in other ways, they also were really clear about it. So Think like there's kind of like three reasons behind it. First is if you use a number, it reminds the listener that it's really hard to say the words, "I was wrong." So you're kind of calling on their sympathy
Yeah,
by using the number, reminding
brilliant.
them that you're doing a hard thing.
Yeah.
And then it's also reminding them that you're in this family with this code. And so you're signaling your membership and your closeness and your love, really. And so it's supposed to be an easy way to disagree without like breaking the relationship.
Yeah, so admitting you're wrong now comes with this warm, fuzzy feeling.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's really, I mean, that's so powerful. I think so much of the friction of human interaction could be boiled down to just not being able to admit that you're wrong and regularly and just
That's Chicago. He's teaching, he's arguing. You know, some people loved his teaching style, very much in charge, very much keeping students on their toes, confrontational. Others found it too much, overwhelming, kind of shut them down intellectually and they couldn't cope with it. And so I think it was kind of go time when he was teaching. In that case, that was a lot of social time, interacting, talking, other professors, going out and giving papers, arguing with the people at Yale or Harvard. Then he would go and do these very deep dives over the summer. He would also regularly do these trips to New York to see Anna Schwartz. So his 12-year collaborator. They didn't have phone calls were really expensive. They did have quite an extensive correspondence, but then they would do these meetings. So he would basically come in at the beginning of the summer, going to Rahway, stop in New York, see Schwartz, and then again on the way back to Chicago. So you'd have these deep check-ins at that point. The other thing that happened is people would come visit him in New Hampshire. And so he had a studio separate from the house. He would go and he would work. And then at night, his friends would come. His friends are all economists. There's a whole like cluster of economists. They all clustered within driving distance of the Dartmouth Library so that they could get
yeah.
their hands on books. And so they would come over and then they would argue and talk into the night. So I think he did need that deep focus time, but it was not like he also lived a very engaged, very embedded social life.
A part of which was his marriage. Is there something you could say about love, about marriage, about relationship that made the whole thing work? Because it was vibrant and they wrote a
Yeah,
biography together.
they did. I mean, they were very complementary. They were kind of the yin and the yang. She was very introverted, somewhat suspicious of others, skeptical, and he was extremely extroverted, optimistic, high energy. And they also were at a time when it was really clear, like for broader society, these are the roles of a man, these are the roles of a woman. And they pretty much adopted those. Now, Rose Friedman did some very important economic work. She's part of the early stages of the theory of the consumption function. She didn't complete her degree because she really knew there wasn't, if she wanted to be married and have children in the world she lived in, there wasn't a real pathway to also being an economist. I do think that a lot of that, it's not, although it feels very just, he's the man out in the world and she's in private. It's interesting because her brother, Aaron Director, was the same way. He was very private man, very shy, very introverted, and he exerted this like quiet intellectual influence on all of his friends. So I think that was just kind of a family trait of being more quiet, preferring to be behind the scenes. It wouldn't have worked any other way because Friedman was so out there, so so extroverted. And there's a bit of a sad thing she said. She said, when I married Milton, I lost half of my conversations. When David came along, I lost the other half. So it's a household that was just dominated by male voices, in which she didn't have a lot of room. What was tricky for me in my research is she didn't leave much of a trace. She put together Milton Friedman's archive and she took herself out of it. So I really had trouble finding her actual voice in the historical documents, and she didn't want to leave that behind. So, it's absolutely essential piece of his success because she's the one who pushed him to do the Newsweek column, to do Free to Choose, and she really wrote Capitalism and Freedom. She took all his random notes and she put them together into a book, and that became this kind of testimony of his ideas, but she shared many of his ideas. And she, without, when I think of Friedman, if you take away Anna Schwartz, if you take away Rose Friedman, if you take away the other woman who collaborated with him, you have a much thinner resume than the one he actually has.
Yeah, it's always sad and it always makes me wonder. about the the private secret conversations between partners
Yeah.
because there are, they might not show up in the record, but they probably influence the person more than almost anything else. Those quiet little conversations.
Yeah.
If we can switch our path to another great mind of the 20th century, Ayn Rand. We talked about some of the similarities here about them being fighters for freedom and fighters for capitalism. What is
So many strong and negative connotations. And she meant, I think, something, she meant, I think, something closer to like self actualization because she really tried to create this idea, tried to create this idea and express the idea that to be truly selfish did not mean trampling on others. It meant just being motivated by your own kind of internal measures and metrics. And so in her fiction, she tries to show this by showing the false selfishness of some of Peter Keating, who's an architect who kind of steps over everybody to advance his career. And she says that's not true selfishness because true selfishness would recognize it's false to take others' work and pass it off as your own. Now the other big piece now the other big piece of objectivism is a very approach that's really inspired and related to Friedrich Nietzsche's idea of revaluing values or a genealogy of morals. And so she says, what's happened here is Western culture has converged on this idea of altruism as good, being selfless and altruistic is good. And this has led us to communism and has led us to devalue the individual in favor of the collective. So, what we need is a new moral code which elevates selfishness, which elevates the individual, and which takes all the things that we have been told are bad and actually says their values. This is what she's trying to do with objectivism. I mean, it is about as ambitious of an intellectual project as there can be. And that's what really draws people in. Yet at the same time, she's flying in the face of the way human morals and ethics and societies have evolved. And she's not able to single handedly recreate them the way she wants them to be.
Yeah, I mean, she's not doing herself any favors by like taking on the words and trying to rebrand them completely.
Hmm.
Like writing the virtue of selfishness. It's like, can we just call it self-actualization?
Yeah.
There's a negative connotation to selfishness and a positive connotation to altruism. So she sometimes, it seems, takes on the hardest possible form of argument.
Yeah. I mean, she had a student and who ended up being very close to her, Nathaniel Brandon, and he was sort of an advisor. And he said, can you please not use selfishness? Like, just come up with another word. But part of her liked it. Part of her wanted to provoke and unsettle. She didn't want to give that up.
I mean, people should listen to her public talks. The her her whole aura, way of being is provocative, and she's a real powerhouse of an intellectual. So like she loves the challenge, and that just listening to her in itself is just inspiring because you could see the individualism radiate from her.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the things I found in researching and writing about her. Like, she's an incredibly unusual human being. And,
Yeah.
and so that was like her strength, right? Because she's so unusual, but it was also her downfall because she looked to herself as a model or to get insight about humanity, and she never quite processed how different she was from other people.
So, just because we talked about Milton Friedman so much, can we just return to what to you, given everything we've said, is the interesting differences about Ayn Rand, her ideas related to Milton Friedman?
Yeah, I mean, broadly, we could put Milton Friedman and Ayn Rand in some sort of category together, but she has this focus on ethics and rationality and this desire to be revolutionary that's much stronger than Friedman. Friedman wanted to overthrow the economic consensus. He didn't want to overturn the moral basis of Western society. So she does something. So in one of Frank Knight's essays, he talks about the ethics of competition. And he says you basically cannot build an ethics out of competition because it would be monstrous to do so, because it would say the winner of this competition is ethically right. And that would open the door to sort of might makes right. And this is what Friedman struggles with. And he says, I can't take capitalist outcomes as ethical unto themselves. I can't do it. Doesn't feel right. And there's this line where Frank Knight says, "No one would ever do this." And I was like, "Oh, Frank Knight, you haven't read Ayn Rand yet, you know?
Hold my beer, yeah.
You're a little too early." Because that's what she does. She takes the outcomes of capitalism and of market competition and says, "These have ethical meaning." And this is where ethical meaning inheres, and it is ethical to try to succeed and to succeed in a capitalist society. Now, what she's able to do is create a fictional world in which people succeed in her fictional capitalist world through ethical behavior. And so she doesn't really have to wrestle with a capitalist world in which people succeed through fraud and corruption and all the other things that might go into someone's success. So she creates the best possible take on success under capitalism. And then she holds that up as an ideal. And I think what's important is that so few people have done that, and she comes at a time when everybody is emphasizing the downsides of capitalism. And she says there's another way to look at it. Here are the good sides of capitalism.
And like you said, she was operating, which I really loved the phrasing of that, in the mythic register.
Yeah.
So she was constructing these characters, these capitalists, that are like the highest form, these great heroic figures, almost romanticizing them.
Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned We the Living as one of the books that you like of hers the most, but can we stay in the mythic register with
Yeah.
The Fountainhead and
Yeah. Yeah.
Atlas Shrugged? What to you are some sort of memorable, inspiring moments, insightful moments from those books, that maybe scenes or ideas that you take away from them that are important to understand?
Yeah. So The Fountainhead is this story of a struggling architect, Howard Rourke, and she kind of follows his life and his career. And the message is really it's a version of To Thine Own Self Be True, right? And Rourke's designs are too avant garde. Nobody appreciates him. And he just keeps doing what he wants to do and is just focused on his own visions, his own genius. I think that's been really inspiring to kind of creators of all types. I think it's fairly unrealistic as a portrait of human achievement, but it's an aspirational idea. I mean, one phrase that comes to mind is there's a character, I forget which one, who is in some sort of adversarial relationship with Howard Rourke and says something to him like, "Well, Mr. Rourke, what do you think of me?" And Rourke says, "I don't think of you." And that to Rand was the ideal. You're not thinking of other people. You're an island unto yourself. You're focused on your own goals, your own capacities, and you're not doing it to impress other people or to be better than other people or to your soul in a way. So that has been very captivating to so many. And The Fountainhead is one of those books we talked about that causes, people read it and they make changes in their life or they feel called to their higher self.
And I think there's also the scene where Rourke, with the dean of architecture of the school, that's speaking to what you're saying. I think to me is inspiring. So this is the dean of architecture that expels Rourke,
Mhm.
and it brings him into a meeting, thinking Rourke will plead for a second chance. And the dean says that Rourke's work is contrary to every principle we have tried to teach you, contrary to all established precedents and traditions of art. Do you mean to tell me that you're thinking seriously of building that way when and if you are an architect? And then, in a gangster like way, Rourke says yes. And then Dean asks, "My dear fellow, who will let you?" And Rourke replies, "That's not the point. The point is, who will stop me?"
Yes. I mean, Rand's coming from communist Russia, but it
Yeah.
has a bit of the don't mess with Texas flavor.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
might say it that really resonates with this idea of anyone who's felt like they're, fighting the powers that be. Um, yeah, it's interesting. I thought you might be going to the quote where he says something like, I inherit no tradition. I stand at the beginning of one.
Yeah.
And I really think Rand's thinking about herself, when she says that she inherits nothing. She stands at the start. But The Fountainhead comes out in the middle of World War II, and it's not expect Rand is an unknown writer. This is kind of a strange book. It's, classic story. It's turned down by 12 publishers before one takes a chance on it. And Rand really loved this story. The editor who read it said this book is great. And his boss said no. And he said, if you don't take this book, I'm quitting. And so she idolized him for doing that. So they print it and it becomes a bestseller just through word of mouth. So it's not advertised, doesn't it gets one good book review, but it people tell each other how much they like this book. And it keeps printing and selling out printings. It's made into a movie. And so it lands in this time when Americans are engaged in this great collective endeavor of World War II. They're making all kinds of sacrifices for the collective. And I think paradoxically, as they do that, they're drawn to this vision of someone who doesn't have to compromise at all, who is leading their life exactly as they want to. Meanwhile, they might be sleeping on an ocean liner because they've been drafted to fight in this war. And they're reading The Fountainhead and they're feeling better about themselves. And so it's also really interesting. The Fountainhead is hugely popular in India, which is fascinating. And, talk to people about this, and they basically say this book comes like a breath of fresh air into a very traditional and conformist culture, and people just latch onto it and they love it, and it gives them that feeling of freedom and possibility that they're hoping for.
Yeah, I mean, it really is a book. Atlas Shrugged can be a bit of that too, but it's more of the philosophy, objectivism, and the details and the nuance of that seeps into Atlas Shrugged. The Fountainhead is very much like a thing that makes you change the path of your life,
Yeah.
and that I mean that's beautiful to see that books can have that power.
And Rand knew that she was doing that, and she knew what she was doing. She this wasn't an accident, and people say, "Oh, she's a bad writer. Oh, her characters are so heavy-handed." She started as a screenwriter. She started as someone who analyzed films for movie studios. She knew exactly how to manipulate plot and character and drama. And she also knew that she was writing. People say, oh, Rand is for, adolescents. Adolescent teenagers love Rand. And that's kind of who she was writing for. And she said, I'm writing for people as they start out on their life and they're thinking about who they want to be. So she's not writing, for the weary middle age. She's writing for the young who are looking for inspiration.
People say that to me sometimes about certain books like Rand, but also about The Alchemist. I know a lot of people for whom The Alchemist and they're adults and they're brilliant people. The Alchemist changed their life. And the same can be said about The Fountainhead.
Yeah.
I I sometimes get criticized for using words that are too simple. It's, can have power, and the cliche thing sometimes needs to be said, and sometimes, if effectively, needs to be said in an over the top way in the mythic register, because that's the thing that resonates with us.
Yeah.
Because we are like heroes of our own story, and
Yeah.
we need to hear that message sometimes to take the bold step, to take the risk, to take the leap.
Yeah, and I mean, the other thing, she knew she was doing kind of propaganda in a way. She was like, "I'm doing pro-capitalist propaganda." And she has a degree from the University of Leningrad.
Yeah.
She's raised up in Soviet Russia. She said, "We need to present the case for the other side in the same way." And that's what she did.
Why do you think she's so divisive? People either love her or hate her.
I mean, I think it's because of that purity that I'm willing to say, sort of, you get what you deserve, and that kind of lack of charity. And part of that in her work is because she creates this fictional world where she can set everything up just so. And so you don't have um contingency or accident or bad luck, or you don't really have a lot of children. You don't have handicap you don't just have this idealized world. And I think it's really infuriating for people who feel that's so inaccurate. How can you be deriving a social theory and philosophy around this? And how can you be missing what seems to many people she's missing the kind of ethical instinct or the altruistic or charitable instinct? And so just become enraged at that, and they don't want to see anyone go that far, and they're outraged that someone went that far, that did the thing that Frank Knight said no one would do. Um, yeah, it's just it's very unsettling.
Would you say that's her main blind spot? The main flaw of objectivism is just how black and white it paints the world? Or if not, I mean, what would you say are the flaws of objectivism?
So, I mean, the big flaw is that it's justified through a fictional world. It's not justified through reference to the real world. It's not empirical in a way. It's not and Rand herself would say this. She's not writing about things how they are, but how they should be. And so that idealism it just really undermines it as a mechanism to understand where we're actually living.
And that is a big contrast with Milton Friedman, who would focus on how things are versus how things should be.
And then I think it's the problem of elevating rationality over any other mode of insight or thinking. And so what happens in Rand's life, and I describe this in some detail in the book, is she essentially creates a cult of reason around her. And people who are drawn into this cult, it's called the Collective. It's a group of young people in New York City who are drawn to her work. And she's already famous, but she's writing Atlas Shrugged. And so she's sharing drafts of Atlas Shrugged as she goes along. And one of the members of the collective to bring all of this together is Alan Greenspan, who later be head of the Federal Reserve. And he's incredibly taken with her. He's one of these people who says, I was a narrow technical thinker. I never thought about ethics or politics or anything bigger until I met Ayn Rand. And she really opened my mind. So he's part of this tight knit group. But over time, in this tight knit group, they think of themselves, we are all individualists. We're dedicated to individualism and capitalism. We're different than everybody else. Over time, they all come to share Ayn Rand's views and opinions on everything from music to art to clothes. She gets a dining room table, and a bunch of them get the same dining room table. And it becomes incredibly conformist because they've all believe they're acting rationally. And they believe that to act rationally is to agree with Ayn Rand.